Welcome everyone to the Eternal Spoiler Breakdown. My name is Pojo. We are going to be talking about two cards today from the upcoming set, something something, Argenport. So yeah, we got one spoiled on Sunday on the RNG Eternal stream, and we have a new one that got spoiled. I'm not sure where. I think it was just a Reddit spoiler of some kind. And both of them look pretty interesting. Void Drummer is promising to be some sort of kind of kooky legendary that we can do a couple of neat things with. And then we also have a card called Rindra's Choice, which is going to be a meta staple, like almost guaranteed for Felm. Should be really, really interesting. Going to be a lot of fun to talk about. Okay, so first off, we got Void Drummer, right? The 3-cost, 2/2 unblockable. This is the second 2/2 unblockable for 3 in Shadow, but this one has double Shadow influence. So it is slightly, there is a slightly larger opportunity cost on it than you would get on a Lethrai Nightblade, which is not a particularly playable card. Now, Void Drummer does have the ability, which is when Void Drummer attacks, units in your Void get +2/+2, which is really, really solid if you're looking for Reanimator type effects. Anything to do with Haunting Scream, anything to do with like Dark Return and Grasping at Shadows. If you are in some way like just trying to play like a bunch of unblockable units and recursion effects, you'll probably have a pretty decent, like reasonable popper deck off of this that you could put out from just this legendary. So picking this up would be an okay thing if you wanted to build like a decent kind of unblockable deck. My thoughts on it is that it's not like insanely strong, but it is pretty cool. Void Drummer's ability is actually quite good, and the other thing about it that is really nice is that 2/2 unblockable is really on the fringe edge of playable. There aren't currently enough unblockable units to like really push things through, but Void Drummer is like that one extra that kind of gives you the ability to do things like play unblockable Divining Rod decks and other sort of like interesting shenanigans. Yeah, like if you want to like build some cool things on a budget, I think this card might actually be a reasonable legendary for those types of decks, although obviously you do need some copies of it. Okay, so yeah, the main thing about it is that it's just a little bit weak on the stat line. A 3-cost 2/2 gets killed by a lot of stuff, and that can be very tricky. It can be easily silenced, it can be easily dealt with by most types of removal, and so it is not particularly easy to stick on the board to actually get that +2/+2 shenanigans going. Similar to Xenon Cultist, which was another card that actually does the same exact thing. You can do like some cool things with it, but like basically if you don't get those stat bonuses, then Void Drummer is probably not worth it on its own. So you have to be pretty careful about how you play it. But if you manage to build around it, there is maybe some potential for it. I'd say that this card could bring back Sporefolk decks. Like if you wanted to do like a lot of interesting ramp stuff where you play things like Xenon Cultist and Void Drummer together, and then you have Haunting Screams or Dark Returns, you can actually get a lot of power in your Void. There's not a lot of things that are actually limiting you on that front now that Steward of the Past has been nerfed. Statuary Maiden is not really going to do it if you are playing out cards from your Void that you have thrown into your Void through discard effects or other stuff like that. So yeah, there's a really good chance that you could actually get like a pile of good Void Drummer triggers and then just have like a 10/10 unit in your Void that you can then throw at your opponent with a Haunting Scream and just kill your opponent off. The main problem with that is that 3-drops are a pretty valuable slot for those types of decks. Like recursion-wise, that's where you put your Gorgon Fanatics and your Beast Callers and all your other stuff. So, and that's already a pretty viable Haunting Scream archetype. But nonetheless, like I think this sort of enables a different type of Haunting Scream archetype. One where you're not actually so focused on the Gorgon Fanatics, and one where, in particular, I think you probably don't run the Beast Colors at all. Like, I think you run the Fanatics for the card draw, and then everything else, like, sort of just handles itself, because all of your stuff is, like, a huge stat block that can actually kill your opponent, and you don't need the Beast Colors to do that sort of finishing move. So yeah, there's some pretty good potential for this card. It is not my favorite type of jank, but it is definitely fun and janky, and there's a lot of fun, silly things that you can do with it, so plenty of stuff that you can play around with. I suspect we'll see at least one more cool Void Recursion card in Argenport, so that'll be really cool to see. Not Argenport the faction, Argenport the set. So yeah, like maybe we'll see something cool out of Void Drummer. I could definitely see a Void Drummer deck becoming popular, but similar to Haunting Scream decks, I don't think it'll ever become like a tier 1 deck. I do think that like this is actually a very powerful ability if it continues to go off. And that's the real key there, is that a 2/2 unblockable is still pretty vulnerable, but if you can keep just sort of drumming in, then yeah, you'll get some 10/10s and 12/12s in your Void, and that is something that is just absolutely horrifying. One thing that you might be able to do with it is play it with a sort of mid-rangey beaters deck where you are running Ion the Abductor. And that way, if you're playing like just like all your basic stuff with Dark Returns, you're doing like Sauropods, you're doing Sandstorm Titans and Worldbearer Behemoths, and you're just doing basically Xenon mid-range with Void Drummers in the middle there, then the Void Drummers can basically just beef up everything in your deck, and then when you play out Ion the Abductor, you just have like a 20-20 unit. And that seems like a pretty reasonable way to go. It's not so great for killers, but it is actually okay there. It does work with Dawnwalkers and other cool stuff on that front. The fact that it's double shadow means that it's harder to splash, but I would say that a dedicated Xenon deck is probably the best route for it outside of Haunting Screen. And I'm interested to see if there's anything else that can actually make it work. It obviously doesn't work with a Revenge or anything like that, sadly, but there are some cool abilities that you can get bonuses on, and assuming you have a good way to protect it, that might actually be a cool thing for like an Argenport style deck. So yeah, we'll see if this card has any play to it. I am not 100% sure that it will, but I do think it's very fun, and it's going to be fun to build decks around. So that's always something I'm looking for out of Legendaries. I really prefer it when Legendaries are like this, where they're designed in a way that as soon as you see them, you're like, oh, I want to build a deck around that, and then you build something cool, and it works. Like, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be like the tier 1 deck, but I think that Legendaries being cool build-arounds is the best way to like sort of make Legendaries exciting when they come out of packs. So that's really fun stuff, and yeah, it's good to have these, good to see them, and I'm glad that they're at the rarity that they're at. Okay, so the other one is not a legendary, and it is instead an extremely powerful uncommon. This is Rindra's Choice. And Rindra's Choice has a first ability that is absolutely crazy, and a second ability that is still absolutely crazy, but not nearly as much. So Rindra's Choice says, kill an enemy unit with more than one faction, or negate an enemy spell with more than one faction. And Inverse Annihilate is absurd. Like there's a lot to say about that. Like basically, if you have an Inverse Annihilate and just mono Shadow, then that completely changes the meta around as to what cards are particularly good. We've talked a lot about how a lot of cards are just way better because they are multicolored, and they have been for like the entirety of like set 1 and most of set 2 as well. Like if you aren't able to throw an Annihilate at your opponent, then it means that you don't get to fast spell remove large scary units at extremely good tempo costs, and that kind of extremely good tempo cost is something that shadow decks are used to really abusing to make like really good things happen. Rindra's Choice means that Feln, which is the deck where Annihilates most often live, is now capable of switching around and changing it so that multicolored cards are the bad cards. That means that like basically, so I would say that this card is probably a clear sign. Oh yeah, so this bears some interesting discussion, because I would say that this card is probably a clear sign that there is going to be a set rotation, which, if you don't know what that means, basically with most types of card games, we definitely rotate sets out. So the set 1 will eventually like become obsolete, and then like all of the set 2 cards plus the set 3 cards will most likely be like the next sort of rotation. Those will be legal in ranked, and then there will be like maybe some sort of vintage mode. Rindra's Choice would be the kind of thing where it's like, oh, this is the Annihilate for the next rotation. This is the removal card of choice that actually causes like the whole like meta to change around, and it's a very powerful card. Like it definitely does some cool stuff. Like it basically completely swaps the meta around on what's good and what's not. It means that those engine cards that we saw in Dusk Road, the Diesel Cycle, the Worldbearer Behemoth, all of those cards are actually going to be a lot more interesting, because we might see basically a lot more people running multicolored removal, and that means that single color cards are going to be like a lot better as a result. So yeah, like there's some potential for that to be pretty crazy. I would say that this card is absolutely insane in power level. The fact that it is hybrid means it's restricted to Feln, which is an interesting restriction. It means that it's not accessible by a lot of other types of decks, but thinking about it, I'm not really sure that it matters too much. Argenport has access to Slay, and they're pretty okay with that. And then like overall, like you've got Xenon, which probably wants this, but could run things like Suffocate, and I'm not saying it's running Cruciate, but it can do a little bit. It can splash for blue if it needs to. It's got all the killer effects. I'd say that Feln is definitely where you want the hard removal, and it's fine if it is restricted to that color for the moment. So yeah, Now, the fact that this is modular is actually just kind of ridiculous. Like, basically, negate an enemy spell with more than one faction, that's not going to come up that often. Like, there aren't that many multicolored spells that are super insane, but, well, there's plenty of them, but I would say that they are not so common that you're going to see one every game. So the fact that it has this sort of modular ability means that you're going to be able to use it against certain things. And I kind of like this from a design perspective because what it essentially means is that you are really capable of using this card even in a situation where you wouldn't be able to use, say, an Annihilate. Like, one of the things that was kind of frustrating about Annihilate was that you would run it sometimes and your opponents would just play entirely multicolored cards, and then you wouldn't be able to play this card against anything. And so I think this makes it a little bit harder for you to do that. Like, basically, this card is almost guaranteed to get some kind of value, and countering a big hybrid cost card is actually kind of crazy. Like, just the fact that Rindra's Choice is an uncommon means that Aid of the Huru is probably, like, not a thing anymore. Like, it is really, really hard to play Aid of the Huru now because Rindra's Choice is just a card that anyone can hold on to, and you have to basically, like, be very, very sure that they don't have the counterspell, because counterspells are finally good now. Like, there is a counterspell here that has a cool modular ability. It is a kill spell on its own, and so, like, basically, if you're looking at any sort of, like, more than one faction huge spell, this is a card that can basically just knock that out and make Feln do really, really terrible things. So, yeah, this is a huge power card for Feln. I think every deck is going to be running 3 to 4 of them. It's got an absurd amount of stuff going on with it. I don't know if you run it alongside Annihilate. I think you actually do swap in Rindra's Choice for that hybridization, and you start looking at whether or not it is that your opponent is just trying to kill stuff. The fact that Rindra's Choice kills things like Tavrod is pretty cool. The fact that it kills any sort of, like, sort of big, scary hybrid units. Like, this is a complete meta change, and it will really shake things up as far as things are concerned. I think there is a lot that changes when Rindra's Choice is good and when Rindra's Choice is uncommon. As a draft card, it's absolutely bonkers. You definitely want one. It doesn't hit as many things as Annihilate does in draft, which is kind of interesting. So it is a much less flexible card in that aspect. But it's still a very good removal card. It's probably something you're going to want to run, and I would say that it definitely punishes hybrid cards in a really interesting way. Yeah, so that's kind of fascinating. Like, hybrid cards getting set up, like, makes for some interesting stuff. I can see an announcement that someone subscribed, and I can't see it on my chat, which is very strange. Maybe it'll pop up in just a second here. Well, we'll figure that out later. In any case, like, I do think that this card is just, like, pretty interesting. Like, it's a huge meta change, and that is definitely very meaningful for the set as a whole. I'm really excited to see what happens, because it just means that a whole variety of different decks are available. A whole variety of different decks are going to, like, be occurring. Like, this is something that I think will change the overall shape of the meta in a really serious way. And yeah, it just makes a lot of cards that were very scary not nearly as scary. Like, you are now able to kill your Svetchas and your Heart of the Vaults and your, oh man, your Tavrods, your giant Champion of Cunnings. Like, you know, like, there's just a wild amount of things that you can hit with this, including Ikaria. Like, there's just so many different things that this just adds to in your Feln repertoire. I'd say it's an insanely strong Feln removal card, and it's definitely going to be doing a lot of good for Feln in particular. The question is, what do the other colors get to sort of make up for that? Feln hasn't had a lot of extra power, but it also hasn't needed a lot of extra power, because it's just been sort of in a very stable place where it has all of the good removal, it has Champion of Cunning, and it kind of just runs the same deck every time. Now it is still in the position where it has a lot of the good removal. It still has Champion of Cunning. So my question is going to be, how does this change the look of Feln? Because we know it changes the look of the meta. But is there a way that the Feln deck in some way changes by having Rindra's Choice? And that's going to be sort of my question going forward as far as Rindra's Choice is concerned. I'm all for it as far as design is concerned. Like, I think that the modular ability on it makes it very, very highly encouraged to play the card, which is pretty important, because you want that card to be played a lot to basically just change up all of the decks that are currently in existence and start making basically multicolored not as good and sort of swap things over. And this might do that. So that's going to be interesting. So yeah, it looks like Argenport, or something Argenport, is going to be a very good meta shift. I am looking forward to seeing what all other cards are available, but it's clear that at least one extremely powerful uncommon is being introduced that is going to do some cool things for the meta, and like, depending on how much extra stuff is in the set, there could be all sorts of interesting changes. So yeah, that's what we got for you, for the YouTube folks. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next time. For the Twitch folks, let's talk about the cards more.